King Creole took his sweet time bringing my parents over. And that worked in my own favor. With the help of my little template friend, I got a scissor blade. What better weapon to kill a voodoo doll-making monster like him with? With renewed vigor, I acted quickly and headed downstairs to get Mary. She was my only real ally in this fight, so her help would be important. Although let's just say she was more than a little skeptical. "That's the worst plan I've ever heard," she said, her face pressed against her hand as she shook it. Well, she didn't have much confidence in me. But at the same time, I didn't hear her coming up with any ideas. "Even if I agree to help you, you're going to be under his control. How are you going to go against that?" she asked me, a quizzical look plastered on her cracked face. "That's where you come in. You ambush him from behind and split his attention. I know for a fact he loses control when he stops focusing," I pointed out to her, handing her half of a scissor. She looked down at the item like it was an armed grenade. Looking up to me. "Where the hell did you get this?" she asked, admiring the surprisingly sharp item. Dragging her porcelain finger across it and scratching her polished skin with the item. "That template doll that sits on my counter," I said quickly, looking back up to the stairs and then to her. "Look, it's not important right now. I'll leave the basement door unlocked, and when you see Creole get close enough to the door, ambush him. It'll get me enough time to be out of his control and help you. Please, Mary. I don't want him to hurt my parents," I begged her, grabbing her hands and squeezing them against mine. She was trembling as she looked down at the item and then up to me. "All right, yes. Okay, I'll do it." She nodded, looking around the basement and walking off in a direction, producing a scarf and pulling it tight against her hands. "I'll wrap this around his neck and fight against him as best I can," she said softly, coming over to me and handing me back the scissor. "You need to cut his head off completely this time. No half-assing it," she said, poking her finger into my chest. I nodded and wrapped my arms around her and pulled her into my chest, thanking her softly before quickly going upstairs to arrange anything else that might help us in our battle against the Voodoo King. My little friend wasn't much help, but he had done more than enough for me. I walked into the office and quickly looked around the boss man's office and looked at the only picture he cared about. Charles and his mama. I took it and shoved it into my suit. Quickly I made my way back to the counter and sat in agonizing silence as I waited for him to show up. It was maybe an hour or 5 later that he strolled right into the shop with my mother and father in tow. I hadn't seen my parents in who knew how long. And when they saw me standing at the counter, my mother screamed and quickly fainted in my dad's arms. Mom always was pretty squeamish. "What did you do to our son, you fucking freak?" my dad shouted, obviously having mixed up feelings about his only kid looking the way I look. Creole simply chuckled and drummed his fingers on his cane. His button eyes turned over to look at me with a more than satisfied smirk. "Travis, my boy. Are you just gonna stand there? Come greet your mama and daddy," he ordered, snapping his fingers. The old familiar pull of the strings forced me over to my parents. At the very least he let me talk. "Dad," I managed to choke out through pent-up tears. I wanted to reach my arms out and hug him tight. My mom started coming around again and she looked at me, reaching a shaking hand out to me. I may have been an undead puppet, but I was still their son. "Travis. My sweet baby boy," my mother whimpered, touching my painted cheeks and touching my combed hair. A forced smile on her face when she saw that. "I always knew you would look handsome if you combed your hair," she said with her loving smile. That alone was enough to break me. For once I was thankful for the strings holding me up, because I just wanted to hold on to my parents tight and just let go. "Aw. Now, as much as I'd hate to break up a sweet family reunion," Creole interrupted, walking over to us and smiling as he rubbed the head of his cane with his gloved hands. "Travis here has been a very, very bad boy. And unfortunately, I do believe the punishment is in order," he hissed, raising his cane and snapping his finger again. My body went as stiff as a board and a smile was forced upon my face as I took the offered cane and raised it above my head and brought it down on my mother's head. With a sickening crack, she went down. I was screaming internally as my dad looked at what I had just done. I wish I could have told him the reason why I'd done it, that I wasn't in control of myself. But I just as quickly raised the cane again and brought it down on his head as well. "Good boy," Creole hummed, wrapping his arm around me and pulling me close. He smiled and pinched my cheek playfully as he took the cane back from the limp noodles my arms had become. He looked at the item and rubbed some of the blood off of the white orb head and patted me on the back. "Be a dear and start taking them to the basement," he ordered, walking over to the basement door to unlock it. And that's when Mary burst through the door and tackled him quickly. He barely had time to react before Mary was on top of him and wrapping the scarf around his neck and pulling it tight. As I had predicted, his control over me faded and I shook off the shock of attacking my parents and quickly pulled the scissor blade out. As Mary fought with him, I ran over and plunged a blade into his mouth. "What are you doing?" Mary shouted, still trying to contain him to the floor as I jostled for space next to her. I didn't have time to answer her, so instead I showed her, dragging the scissor across his stitched-up mouth and cutting free all of them. His jaw dropped open soon enough, and that black sludge began to leak out of his mouth. Next, I started putting the blade against his throat and started slicing as many stitches as I could. But inevitably he threw us off and stumbled to his feet, barely able to stand on his own. "Oh, you've fucking done it now," he snarled, spitting out loads of that black sludge as he stumbled forward to us. He covered his mouth to keep the fluid inside of him and kept his other hand on the cane to keep himself up. It was clear to me now that the black sludge was somehow keeping his rotting corpse alive. So getting it out of him was the key to beating him. "Now Charles," I said through pants, reaching into my suit and pulling out a picture of his mother. "Didn't your mama ever teach you not to swear?" I asked, removing the picture from the frame and stabbing the blade through it. If I pissed him off before, I really fucking pissed him off with that stunt. He seemingly got a second wind and pounced on me, tackling me to the floor and beating me with his fists and his cane when he felt like it. He might very well have killed me if Mary hadn't stabbed him in the button eye with one of her shards. He screamed something fierce and fell off of me. His left button eye cracked in two and fell off to the floor. He looked up at her with his single remaining button and forced himself to stand back up. "Going to kill me again, you whore?" he asked her, reaching out for his cane and using it to push himself up. Obviously, his strength was waning as the floor was starting to be coated in his black sludge. "No, Charles. I'm finally going to end this," she said, helping me back up and handing me to the scarf to clean my bleeding face. I struggled to stand as well, but I finally managed and brandished my blade out like it was a knife. The Voodoo King Creole was finally about to be bested. Except for the fact that we were in his shop, where he had all the power. "It won't be that easy," he chuckled, which turned into a coughing fit as he covered his mouth again. I was ready for anything until I noticed the wall of voodoo dolls was empty. I swallowed a lump in my throat as I pointed it out to Mary. We both collectively looked around and then up to the ceiling, where dozens of button eyes stared back at us. "Forgot about those," I said, having forgotten all about Creole's bodyguards. They fell on us like a pile of rats, each of them stabbing us with needles or razor blades or even little claws that they had built in. Mary had an easier time with it. She was made of porcelain, so it was much harder to actually hurt her. Me on the other hand, I was getting torn to shit. They slid down from my strings and just had a blast slicing me and stabbing me. Creole meanwhile struggled his way towards his office, most likely to sew up the damage to himself, when the front door opened, and a familiar British accent spoke out. "Don't listen to him anymore," Olivia's mother shouted out, her face twisted in fear and determination. All the voodoo dolls suddenly stopped and looked over to one that used to be among their ranks. Creole stared at her like he'd kill her if she said another word. But it didn't stop her. "He has hurt all of us and caused you to forget who you used to be. You were all people once, lied to and betrayed by him. He's the enemy of us all." She pointed to the limping Creole, who looked around as all the dolls turned their head to him. "You all got what was coming to you. You asked for something and I gave it to you," he declared. The voodoo dolls weren't persuaded, however. They all looked at each other and then leaped from me and Mary onto Creole. He cursed something fierce as they swarmed him and tackled him to the ground. It was like ants swarming dropped food. "Thank you," I said to Olivia's mother. She waved it off and quickly took the scissors from me and reached up to cut off my strings, only for me to stop her and point to my unconscious parents. "Help them first, please," I said quickly. She looked at me with hesitation but quickly nodded, kneeling and pulling each of them out of the shop. "Was that part of your brilliant plan?" Mary asked after a moment. I looked over to her and chuckled. rubbing my combed hair and messing it up some, sighing happily at being able to do that. Of course, I'm a master strategist, I declared, although our joking was short-lived when Creel's hand burst through the pile of voodoo dolls and emerged from them, his button back and his stitches fixed. Guess having dolls made out of all the items he needed to fix himself up with to attack him wasn't the best idea. God, he was like a cockroach. Everyone's betraying me today, he snarled, fixing his tie and storming over to us. Me and Mary backed up and pointed our makeshift weapons at him. I peeked over him to see all the voodoo dolls lifeless on the floor. They had fought a good fight. I backed up and my foot hit something on the floor. Looking down, a beautiful sight met my eyes. My dad's Zippo lighter. It must have fallen out of his pocket when Olivia's mother had dragged him outside. Thank you so much for being a smoker, Dad. I reached down and lifted up the item, flicking it to life and tossing the burning flame over to the pile of voodoo dolls. And those babies must have been made of gasoline because they went up quicker than a forest fire. No, Creel screeched, staring back at me in horror as the fire began to spread further across the shop. You fucking idiot. Have you any idea what you've just done? He shouted at me, staring back at the growing inferno. The smoke from the voodoo dolls began to rise, but then the smoke seemingly turned at a 90-degree angle and headed down towards the basement. At the time I had no idea what had just happened. Now with hindsight, it was pretty clear. That smoke was the souls trapped in the voodoo dolls. And they were heading down to their bodies. Looks like your time on Earth is finally up, Charles, Mary declared. Creel turned to her and grabbed her by the hair, pulling her out of my reach and forcing me to stay stiff against the front door as he backed up away from me. Oh, don't think you ain't coming with me, whore, he snarled. I watched in horror as shambling, rotting corpses started rising up from the darkness of the basement. Some had no flesh to speak of and were just bones shambling for their revenge. Creel looked back and shoved Mary into their waiting clutches. She was grabbed and began to be torn apart. I guess for eating their corpses, maybe. I shouted, horrified that my only friend was being killed right before my eyes. But she looked back with not an ounce of fear in her eyes. Instead, she smiled and nodded towards me. I think it was her way of thanking me for being with her, being her friend, and helping her escape the hellish torture. She waved goodbye to me and was shattered into a million fragment pieces, all of them shining and dropping to the floor. This ain't over, Travis. I'll make sure you suffer for all of this, Creel screamed as his shop was engulfed in fire and the rotting corpses of his victims came closer and closer to him, his back to them as he shoved his finger towards me. You don't get out of this that easily, he screamed as he was grabbed from behind and dragged back towards the basement door. He kicked and screamed, his stitched-up mouth breaking open once more and his sharp yellow teeth snapping at anything. This isn't over, he screamed one last time as the creatures pulled him down into the basement and the fire engulfed the door. Then, the strings went slack and fell to the ground. I looked at them, and my hands shook as they seemingly disappeared into thin air. I was free. But I didn't have time to waste. The fire was spreading fast, and I needed to get out of there before I became one with the shop permanently. But there was one thing I knew I could save: braving the roaring fire. I walked over to the counter and saw that my little template friend was still sitting there. I reached out and grabbed him. Shoving him into my pocket, I quickly rushed out of the shop as the fires reached the ceiling. I exited and came upon Olivia's mother tending to my parents. He's gone. So is Mary, I said sadly, looking to the floor and starting to cry. She reached out and wrapped her loving arms around me, hugging me tight as I let out all my pent-up emotions out all over her. I may have been free from him, but I wasn't back to normal. I still had button eyes, pale skin, stitches across my neck, and those stupid rosy cheeks. Guess I would have expected that to change back to normal, but I guess not. Alexandra, the woman said after a period of letting me cry. I looked at her confused, and she gave a loving smile to me. My name. So you can stop calling me Olivia's mother. She chuckled, tousling my hair and getting a sad but genuine chuckle out of me. Guess I never did ask her her own name, huh? Alexandra helped me take my parents to our house just as the fire department showed up to fight the fire. Let's say the police were livid when they saw the burning voodoo establishment. Turns out, as told to me by Alexandra, that the police force made a deal with Creel decades ago. He keeps crime low for them, and they don't investigate when anyone goes missing. A beautiful partnership. It also explains why no one ever investigated us. And why that Ricky did. No one told him not to fuck around with King Creole. Arriving home with my parents, Alexandra assured me that their wounds were not serious. And that they would recover. That left me plenty of time to think. To think about how to change myself back to normal. Don't get me wrong, immortality sounds great and all. But if it means once again being cooped up in my room for my entire life, I'd rather at least try to find a way to change back. I also had to find a way to tell my parents the entire story of what happened. Let's just say, this site helped a lot in that department. When they did wake up. It was a little awkward for them to see me like this at first. And I know they still try to avoid eye contact with me. But they still love me. And are so happy to have me back in the house with them. They offered to help me in my search to reverse this, but they've been through so much already that I decided to go it alone. Well, with the help of Alexandra and Olivia, of course. And the template. He's no normal voodoo doll. For once he can communicate with me. Well, kinda, he leaves me little notes from time to time giving my advice and updates. More often than not it's that he loves me. Cute little guy is thankful I saved him. For now, I've been trying to get into contact with anyone who knows anything about voodoo and curses. Not much success. Just your usual nuts that shit themselves when they see me. But I'm giving it my all to try and find a way to fix myself. Now more than ever. I've been able to finally fall asleep and enjoy a good night's sleep for the first time in who knows how long. But one night I had a dream. A nightmare really. I was back in the shop. The burnt out remains of the shop. And the only thing intact was the basement door. Reaching out to open it, I entered it and walked down the winding and twisting path. I made it down to the basement. There I saw him. Sitting in a chair waiting for me. He looked up at me with a big smile. A cup of wine in his hand as he looked up at me. My body froze as he set the cup next to him and stood up, walking over to me and giving a wider smile. I told you. It ain't over, Travis. He chuckled, patting my cheek and suddenly growing those sharp yellow fangs and leaning in to bite me. I woke up in a cold sweat, panting hard and looking around my room. Rubbing my head and shivering, I looked over to the voodoo template on my nightstand. And he knew why I was panting. He pointed to the window. I staggered over to it and looked out of it. In the darkness, one normally couldn't see what was standing out there. But with my button eyes, I saw him standing underneath the street lamp. He tipped his top hat to me, and when the streetlight flickered back on, he disappeared. He isn't dead. But I'll make sure he is.